are up and running. Hey everybody, my name is Emily and I'm the community manager here on 2 Diabetes, working with Diabetes Hands Foundation. If you're watching us on YouTube, feel free to join the 2 Diabetes community at 2diabetes.org so that you can see more of these events. And today, our live interview, this is our second interview as part of our Type 2 Diabetes series of interviews this October and November. And we're meeting today with Susan Guzman to talk about shame and blame in type 2 diabetes. This is such an interesting and important topic. Susan, I just put the camera on you. First off, welcome and thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us who you are to start?
Sure. So I'm Susan Guzman and I'm a diabetes psychologist. And I am a co-founder and director of clinical and educational services at the Behavioral Diabetes Institute here in San Diego. And I'm working on a project to try and change the conversation about diabetes. So I'll look forward to talking to you about that.
What's your project to change the conversation first? And then we'll get into what's the conversation that we want to change.
All right, sounds good. So the project's called See Me, See Diabetes, and it's really a movement that I'm hoping to spark that really looks at the stereotypes, the misinformation, the myths around diabetes, and changing the conversation away from shame and blame to a conversation that feels more supportive and understanding. I kind of put it like, if you struggle with having people get what it's like to have diabetes, my vision is that people would get it, appreciate how hard it is, and encourage you instead of point fingers.
So if we kind of start out with, if we're thinking about the topic of shame and blame, and we start out with, what do you think is sort of the current state of affairs in our social discourse around diabetes, and also sort of among healthcare providers, the kinds of messages that people with diabetes are hearing?
I think that we're hearing a lot of negative messages. I have struggled to find a single article, especially written about type 2 diabetes, that doesn't always make the linkage with obesity. And I think an unfortunate consequence to that is that people think that type 2 diabetes is only about making poor lifestyle choices. And so it really leads people to feel blamed for their diabetes, that they're a burden on the healthcare system, that if they only weren't lazy or some other character flaw, they would be able to be healthy. And they oversimplify the disease and its causes.
So it feels like such a complicated issue, because there are linkages between type 2 diabetes and diet and exercise and all of these things that we call lifestyle factors. And I think those linkages socially really confuse people into thinking like, oh, so if somebody has type 2 diabetes, it's just because they ate the wrong food and they didn't exercise, and therefore they brought it on themselves. And I think that's kind of the crux of the issue. This is where we get to that blame, is people hear all these prevention messages and think, well, then you can prevent type 2 diabetes, and if you got it, you just didn't do the right stuff to prevent it, and I don't feel bad for you. And I think that's a rampant public misconception. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that we have to go back and what's the truth? And what we're uncovering about the truth is evolving. So I think we used to think that it was primarily a lifestyle disease. And then the more we've learned about genetics and other environmental factors, we're saying, oops, you can't eat your way into diabetes if you don't already have a genetic predisposition. A new study that came out yesterday actually talked about the role of pollutants and the role of our medications that we're taking, and in particular antidepressants can be a big culprit for weight gain, and our gut bacteria, and that our gut bacteria plays a huge role not only in weight but in the development of type 2 diabetes. And so there's a lot of things that we're learning that should be changing the conversation away from just talking about obesity. And some of the same factors that cause diabetes also cause obesity. And so it's part of it is that chicken and egg problem, but we do know, and here's the challenge, how do we talk about this in a way that invites people in instead of pushing them away. If we're blaming and shaming people, it doesn't encourage them to get engaged and involved with diabetes. They want to avoid it. You know, if having diabetes means that you feel like a failure, you know, you certainly don't want to engage in a community like this, because you don't even want to think about it.
Right, right. Well, so, and as a clinical psychologist, you work with people with diabetes, right? What's some of the psychology that you see around this?
Well, I think that one of the big things has to do with the feelings of shame and guilt, and probably what I would call avoidance behavior. So, you know, if you think about, if you're told by a doctor that you have type 2 diabetes and you've been on medication and you're being told to lose weight as if that there's some magic bullet that makes that happen, and over a period of time your numbers start to climb and you're told it's time to start on insulin, and maybe you've even been told, you know, if you don't do what I'm, you know, make these lifestyle changes, if you don't get this weight off, you're going to end up on insulin. And so when it's time, a lot of times people feel like a failure. So one of the major studies on diabetes distress in people with type 2 diabetes found that most people with type 2, about 3/4 of the people with type 2, feel like they are failing at their lifestyle. So that, you know, they're not eating well enough, they're not checking enough, they're not exercising enough, and that they really develop that sense of failing at diabetes. And, you know, when you feel like a failure always, again, it doesn't really invite people in to take more action, because why would I bother? You know, it's kind of a losing battle no matter what I seem to do. So there's a lot of more subtle ways that diabetes and feeling like a failure can show up. We call that diabetes distress. And that's a big problem. And as well as, you know, depression is also, you know, there's been arguments about whether it's more prevalent in diabetes as it is in other chronic illness groups. But we do know that when depression does show up in diabetes, that it really affects people's health.
Right. So we go from these sort of public misconceptions about diabetes and what causes it and what people can do about it, that then people with diabetes can kind of internalize and feel like I'm always failing at this, and the eventual result can be poor health outcomes. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. We know that both distress and depression related to diabetes really shows up in management. And it makes sense, you know, if you think about it, if you don't feel like people are supportive, if you feel like what you do doesn't matter, if you feel hopeless about complications, if you feel ashamed of having diabetes, it doesn't invite people in to say, you know, I'm going to take the best care of myself I can because it matters.
Right. Right. It doesn't cause people to feel empowered to do all that. You know what, something I find interesting about this is, I would say socially, at least in the US, people feeling like they should eat better and exercise more, like that right now feels like a part of our culture. Like that is common cultural discourse, is like we all should eat better and exercise more, and you know, and we have all of these like apps and tools and things to track what we're eating and to gamify exercise to try and help people stay motivated. Like, I think culturally, we have a really strong recognition that it's easier said than done, that we all struggle to eat well and exercise regularly. And yet, when it comes to people who have type 2 diabetes, all of a sudden, there are all these fingers pointed that are like, oh, you didn't manage to eat better and exercise, despite the fact that we all struggle with that. Do you have any ideas why that particular population, even though this is something that most people, even without diabetes, can relate to, why is it so heavy on people with type 2?
Well, I'm going to get real psychology nerdy on you here.
Please
do. There's a phenomenon called the illusion of control. So it's the reason people would gamble and things like that. We like to think that we're more in control of our world than we really are. It helps us have a sense of safety in the world. You know, if we were constantly processing information based on real statistics, we might be afraid to drive to work. So we have a necessary and important illusion of control. And when bad things happen, as a result, sometimes people will experience a blame the victim, because if I'm more in control, then something bad happening it has to be their fault. Otherwise, maybe I'm not in control either. And so, and that's a real important sense of trust and functioning in the environment. It gives us a sense of safety. So when something tears at that illusion of control, oftentimes what happens is a blame the victim phenomenon. So, you know, 60% of the people in the US are struggling with their weight. And you don't have to be very overweight to develop type 2 diabetes if you have the underlying predisposition. In fact, you don't have to be overweight at all. And so I think that, you know, given the fact that it hits sometimes a little too close to home, it's easier to blame the victim than to look in the mirror and say, gee, I might be at risk too.
Speaking of not being ashamed to have diabetes, I'm not ashamed that my blood sugar is low right now and I'm eating.
I'll try and talk more while you're treating your
No, because you actually said something I wanted to comment on. So excuse me, everyone who's watching, excuse me while I finish chewing on a glucotab, but you just now said that you don't have to be very overweight or even overweight at all to develop type 2 diabetes if you have the underlying genetic predisposition. And here's, I think, the piece that maybe is missing in our public messaging and our public our understanding as a society of type 2 diabetes is that it's genetic. There is a genetic predisposition to this. It isn't just, you know, that joke, that horrendous joke that goes around sometimes on Facebook about like Jim has 45 candy bars and Jim eats 40 candy bars and the punchline is Jim has diabetes. It's not funny, it's offensive, and it's completely not based in any understanding of what diabetes is or what causes diabetes. What do you think, given that sort of the complexity of messaging, what do you think we with diabetes can do to try and help get people past that misunderstanding? There are factors that can relate to diet and exercise and weight management in type 2 diabetes. It's not that those things are unimportant. And there's this issue of genetic predisposition. So it's very complex.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's a good question with a lot of answers to it. So I think the first is we have to all be educated ourselves. Unfortunately, I think a lot of what I see is when people have bought into these messages. So I have a lot of people with type 2 diabetes that'll come to my programs and say, this is where I belong. I did this to myself. I was warned I needed to lose more weight. And they really already come to the table with a sense of failure. So I think it's really important that we work on some core messaging where we can say both, I am not to blame, and what I do matters. So, and I really feel like we need to be confident of that before we can sell it, if you will. So I think you're really looking at your own beliefs about diabetes and really deciding how you are going to feel about your own diabetes is the first place people have to start. And then I think then it'd be interesting to hear from the community what some things people have tried. But I'm really encouraging those people who feel like they, you know, kind of like what you just did, Emily, you openly treated your diabetes, that we can't teach people how hard of a disease it is. We can't encourage them to understand how complicated it is and what a burden it is to live with it if we aren't open about it. And so I think it's really important that we start talking about diabetes and all of its complexities, but not apologizing for it. You know, just like, you know, you don't have to say, I'm sorry, I'm having a low blood sugar, because you have diabetes. That's just what you need to do. You don't and shouldn't be sorry for it. That's a good thing.
Absolutely. I think of it in a way as sort of diabetes pride. I feel like we need a pride movement. Not entirely unlike the gay pride movement in some ways, of people who are just willing to be big and loud and unapologetic about having diabetes, and specifically about having type 2 diabetes, because type 2 diabetes carries with it a stigma that I think type 1 socially does not carry. So we had a really good comment and question from Terry in the chat room, and I'm going to read it because it's a little bit long, so I didn't memorize it. Terry's comment is, in a 2 diabetes discussion thread about the use of the word lifestyle in the popular press as a code word to imply blame and shame toward people with type 2 diabetes, even some of our very own community defend its use under the banner of personal responsibility. So here's this juxtaposition again of, you know, there are factors related to exercise and diet, and anyone with diabetes of any type has to be responsible for their management, and at the same time, people can't be blamed for having diabetes because folks think that it had everything to do with their behavior and that's it. So Terry's question is, how can we advocate against blaming and shaming on behalf of those with type 2 diabetes when even those who we think maybe should know better defend those tactics? So there are folks who we think, who are people with diabetes, who will also say, well, you know, it is a lifestyle issue. It is a disease of lifestyle. How can we help dispel that? So you've already touched on this. Let's see if we can go a little deeper.
Oh boy, well, I think again, let's go back to sort of the 100-foot view, which is that words matter. And I think again, when we're saying lifestyle, in some ways, we're saying to the person that if you only ate right and moved your body enough, you either wouldn't have diabetes or it wouldn't be hard to manage. And we know that's just way too simple of the problem. And sorry, I lost you for a second. So I think again, so part of the problem is that saying lifestyle factors does sort of implicitly imply you didn't do a good enough job with eating and moving your body. And you know, I wouldn't necessarily object to it being part of a thread. So lifestyle factors we know do have a role, and they are important that you work on those things to manage your health. They're important for everyone, as you pointed out. I also think that we need to start bringing to light all of the other variables that are playing a role. I mean, how do we make sense of some of these new studies that pollutants make it harder to lose weight and are a predictor of type 2 diabetes? You know, so you're going to blame someone for the air they breathe and the cities they live in. It's just, it's really complicated. And let's say you've been treated for depression and you've taken an antidepressant medication. That's unfortunately a predictor of type 2 diabetes. You know, do we blame people for that? So again, I think that we can talk about lifestyle factors as being part of, I think, the management. I think it's a big mistake to talk about it as a cure or a fix.
So we see sometimes, I think, with some regularity, folks who have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and really threw themselves into making some lifestyle changes, and in so doing, have maybe they were initially prescribed oral medication for their type 2, and then they were able to go off of that oral medication. And sometimes people will say either that they have cured their diabetes, or their diabetes, I've heard the word remission, my diabetes is in remission because I'm not taking medication anymore, or I have beaten diabetes. There's this whole list of words that people use, some of them who have diabetes and some who are healthcare providers who are saying, you know, with my services, we can cure your diabetes. Let's talk a little bit about that language and whether that's language that needs to somehow be changed in this effort to create a better social understanding of diabetes. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. I think the word cure in diabetes has been a big setup, not only for people with type 1 diabetes, but I think for people with type 2. I think the word remission is possible, unfortunately, sometimes we've seen remission with type 2 diabetes, and we call it remission because it's not a cure. And what happens is people can have, sometimes they'll have like gastric bypass surgery, for example, and they'll lose a lot of weight. There's also a change in their gut microbes, maybe a connection there. So when you're thinking about these kinds of changes, and gosh, how do I put this? Sorry, I lost my thought. When you're thinking about these, Emily, what was the last part of your question?
Whether we might need to change language around
remission
or remission. Terry in the chat room just reminded me another word people use is reversing diabetes.
Yeah, reversing diabetes. Well, first of all, I think that we need to be honest about what that is. Now, we do tell people all the time, you know, for every 5 pounds of weight loss, you have these changes in your control. And you have to recognize that there's still an underlying metabolic disease. There's an underlying metabolic disease. In fact, Steve Edelman is what I was trying to pull up earlier. Dr. Edelman last week at TCOID in San Diego got asked a question from a person with type 2 diabetes, and she said, is it ever possible for me to get rid of my diabetes if I just, you know, basically don't eat very much, and I'd be able to get, you know, cure my diabetes or get rid of it? And he said, there is no cure. And he goes, a cure would be that you could gain all the weight you want and you don't get diabetes back. That's a cure. So other than that, we talk about diabetes getting into remission. Now, even with dramatic weight loss and huge lifestyle changes, that's still, the underlying metabolic disease is still there. And even when people have things like gastric bypass surgery, they're not able to keep their diabetes in remission, even when they are able to maintain weight loss over time. You know, because of the progressive nature of the disease, it tends to creep back in, and then people feel like they blew it again. And I think that one of the things you mentioned that's a really big problem is that healthcare professionals often talk about being on less medication as a goal. And I feel like that's such a setup in type 2 diabetes, that we know that, you know, beyond just lowering blood glucose levels, that it's a disease of lipids and blood pressure. And people often need 4 to 6 medications to keep those in a safe place. So what I'm always when I always talk to people about being on less medication, I say that's a nice goal, but I hope that you're picking the right battle. Because being on less medication and have your numbers not being in a safe place is not the right battle to pick. But I have to tell you, if you sit in a room with people with diabetes and you ask them how many of them have a goal of being on less medication, nearly everyone will raise their hand. And to me, I mean, I get it. I don't want to be on more medication either. And at the same time, I feel like those messages to be on less medication is really pushed as part of I think, the dangerous conversation in diabetes.
I have to say, you know, I feel like I have a lot of friends who do not have diabetes. I actually do know some people who don't have diabetes. Who are very strong proponents of, you know, oh, I don't want to take medication. I don't want to be addicted to medications. I don't want to be dependent on medication. I don't want to need anything. And as a person who's had diabetes almost my entire life, it's a sore spot for me to hear that, because I feel like, well, you know, let's not imagine that it's always a bad thing, because medication is really necessary for some of us. Mm-hmm. And can really make first off, keep us from dying, mm-hmm. Number one. And after that, improve our lives, improve our health, improve our abilities. So I think that message around like, oh, medication, now you're addicted to something is, mm-hmm. I feel like that's another sort of piece mm-hmm. of important language that is really problematic, as you say.
Yeah, I think actually our beliefs about medication and what it means to be on them is a really big problem. Mm-hmm. And, you know, unfortunately, diabetes requires it, but we don't tell people, again, the good news in diabetes. So there's a reason they're prescribing all these medications. And we have really exciting results now that show both people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes are living much longer, healthier lives. they're, able to prevent or stave off complications or live well with complications. But all those things require a medication help. So medications had a huge role in why diabetes outcomes have improved. So I think that, we don't really tell that side of the story often enough.
I think that's right. We have some great comments and questions in the chat room right now. Let me share one. Here's a question, or a couple of questions from Brian, who's saying words do matter, and he asks, how can we change the conversation with our healthcare providers? Should we talk to them about how being told we're too fat makes us feel? Should we speak about our sense of failure? What do you think are some effective ways for people with diabetes to approach this topic with healthcare providers about how we want to interact with them and what kind of language and interaction is actually helpful to us?
That's a great question. I think that, it does require the right person to speak up to a physician. I feel like that not everybody is going to have the thick of skin that might require, because a lot of times when we go to our healthcare professional, we feel vulnerable. We need them for their help. And so to push back, not everyone can do that. But if you are willing to do that, I would suggest that you do talk about how it makes you feel. And I would use feelings words like makes me feel blamed and ashamed and guilty, and it doesn't help me motivate to make change. It makes me want to withdraw or makes me feel like I've failed. I think they need to hear that because when I'm giving talks and trainings to healthcare professionals, which I have the pleasure of doing regularly, it is amazing how many myths they've bought into themselves. That they think that people who struggle with diabetes, lack motivation, or that, that it's a matter of willpower, or, it is simpler than it really is, that they don't have a sense of real life diabetes. And so part of what you can do as a person with diabetes is to educate your healthcare professional about how those messages make you feel. And if you could make a suggestion to them about what would help you, because what helps you would maybe not help somebody else, but, to tell them how they could treat you differently. I have had a few patients do that with their doctors, and it made a huge difference. Someone was actually, stood up to their doctor and said that, they really didn't appreciate being called non-compliant. And so that doctor really turned it around and made a real effort to treat him with respect after that.
Wow, that's fantastic. Karina in our chat room noted a little while ago that it can be risky to speak up sometimes, especially if we're talking about with a healthcare provider. It can feel like, well, I need this person, and I can't. The dynamic with a healthcare provider can feel like, well, I can't criticize my healthcare provider because they have this sort of authority and they provide something that I need. I'm a captive audience. So it can feel scary. And that's just talking about with healthcare providers, let alone, being out about our diabetes with potential employers and, the rest of the folks that we interact with. What do you think about that fear that people might have to speak up with their healthcare providers?
Yeah, I don't think it's for everyone. I feel like I consider myself an advocate and very assertive with doctors, and something happened to me recently, and it hurt my feelings so bad, and I said nothing, and I went back to my car and cried. And then after I sort of recomposed myself,
this was with a healthcare provider?
Yeah, that I decided that I was going to do something about it, and so I called the patient advocate, and I told them why it bothered me. And unfortunately, when you go that route, it sometimes ends up being instead of just being feedback to the healthcare professional, which is all that I really wanted, they end up doing more of a disciplinary response, and and that doesn't necessarily get you any change or really looking for the outcome that you're hoping for. So that was a lesson learned for me. I think that that's why, as a community, I think that we need to come together as a force for change, because those who can't speak up because they are afraid, and maybe for good reason, that those of us who can speak up for you, we need to. And so it's like, I think if we banded together as a community of people who, like, I don't have diabetes, but I love lots of people who do. And, you know, so my goal in this is to be part of that support. And I think that if people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes could come together, we then have the numbers to start really forcing change. People aren't going to want to change. So, you know, we're going to have to be able to advocate, speak up, in some ways be really courageous.
Mm. I really think that's true. I think and I think it's true of any sort of effort towards social change for a stigmatized group of people. Mm-hmm. Is that some folks will be in a position to sort of be public and strong and speak up safely without having to worry about their job or their health care or the safety of their family, things like that. And some people are not in that position. And so I really agree with you so strongly that those of us who are in a position, whether we have diabetes or not, whether we have type 2 or another type of diabetes, type 1 or gestational diabetes, whatever, anybody who's in a position to speak up and try to dispel some of the misinformation that's out there and talk about the importance of language, I think it's for those of us who care about people with diabetes, it's incumbent upon us to do that.
Absolutely.
So here is another question. This one comes from Karina in the chat room. She says, does Susan think that there is a classist aspect to the blaming and shaming of type 2 diabetes? After all, I don't see a lot of finger wagging at people, people at the affluent who indulge in rich foods or insist on eating out of the season foods despite environmental cost. That's a really interesting new piece of this conversation. Do you feel like there might be a classist aspect to this?
There very well could be. I think especially because when we look at the demographics of type 2 diabetes, they tend to be in, you know, more impoverished, you know, the most highly prevalent, and also in places that are, you know, poorer towns and states and cities and so on. So I do think that there could be a component that we maybe associate it with, you know, a lack of socioeconomic status, and, you know, people who are uneducated. That might be another thing. You know, that if you knew better, you would do these things, where, you know, if you see an affluent person, you may less likely to think, oh, well, they must have some other cause or something. I mean, that's a very interesting question that I think has some, unfortunately, probably some real validity behind it.
I'm wondering if, along with that, there might be a racial component to it because of the communities that tend to have really higher rates of type 2 diabetes. African Americans is one of those communities. So I wonder, and this is a question I want to ask all the folks who are watching right now too, because we're getting into some really like touchy and challenging topics that are likely to have some really high emotional value to them. If folks feel like some of that shaming and blaming really is related to racism and classism and sort of a concept that people get type 2 diabetes because they're uneducated, that there are sort of cultural factors in addition to what people tend to call those lifestyle factors, with that word that we really hate. And while people ponder that, wait. Do you have anything else you want to say about it before I ask you another question, Susan?
No, I think you said it well. These are touchy topics that are, and you know, when we're talking about social perceptions, I think if we're going to have a real honest conversation, we have to be willing to talk about other factors that relate to biases and prejudice about how we process information. And of course, gender and race and socioeconomic status, those are all things that are probably going to relate to perception. And
right.
So I think it's unfortunate, but it's true.
It really is. Terry in the chat room is reminding me that Indigenous Americans is another population that has been hit really, really hard with type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely.
So earlier in the chat room, there was a question that I missed, and I'm trying to go back to it because I've had a couple requests that I ask it, only I missed it and now I can't find it. I believe the question had to do with eating well. So we have sort of a historical concept of what eating well means in the US. And that concept, I think, has to do with, you know, the picture of the plate, and it's got a piece of meat and some vegetables, and then like a potato or a pile of rice or some, maybe a delicious whole grain, who knows. So if that's our concept of eating well, and we all know that for some people with diabetes, a pile of rice and or a potato or even a whole grain thing actually is potentially not the best idea because it affects blood sugar dramatically. How do you think we get past this concept of what it means to eat well if it doesn't apply the same way to people with diabetes?
Yeah, I think again that goes all the way back to the bigger problem, which is that I think even people with diabetes are confused, right? I mean, you get a lot of mixed messages because the story keeps evolving as we learn more. So what we used to think was just about sugar, but then we learned it was about carbohydrates. Then we learned, gee, glycemic index and fiber plays a role. And oh, and gee, how much protein I have with that carbohydrate is important. And I think that the whole role of eating gets very confusing. But I think the bottom line is what we put in our mouths is nobody else's business unless you've asked them to take part in it. So, I mean, and when you get back to it, I feel like that's really the bottom line. You know, I don't understand why it's so easy for people to give advice to people with diabetes. It's really puzzling to me. I have a chronic illness and people don't give me advice about it. And but you know, you can know very little and feel like you can offer something helpful to someone who's lived with it for 30 years. It's really puzzling to me.
I agree. It's a fascinating thing. As someone who's had diabetes, again, almost my whole entire life, I've gotten so many suggestions from people who learn how long I have had diabetes and then say, hey, did you read about cinnamon curing your diabetes? Have you tried it? Did you try blueberry leaf tea? Because I heard that cures diabetes. I mean, there's all this misinformation. And I think a lot of times it's true. People offer suggestions in the spirit of helpfulness. You know, I mean, offering a suggestion, I always assume if you're offering me a suggestion, it's because you think it would be useful to me. You're not trying to be, I don't know, dismissive of my condition or anything like that. But again, it shows how little our general population understands about the experience of having diabetes. I mean, I've had so much blueberry leaf tea and I still have diabetes.
Darn it.
Maybe just a few more cups and I'll be done.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to follow the spirit of the conversation, it means you didn't do something right? It wasn't hot enough, you didn't drink enough of it.
Right, exactly. I wasn't dedicated enough to my blueberry leaf tea regimen. So in talking then about that piece, we've talked a lot about sort of misinformation about type 2 diabetes and people feeling really blamed and shamed for having it. And then what about the management part, the messages that we get from healthcare providers? And I think this is true probably for everyone with every kind of diabetes, tends to be, you need to try harder at this, you need to do different at this, your A1C is still too high. We tend to get this deluge of messages that seem to sort of focus on the negative, and I think logically a lot of people translate that into, I'm doing this wrong, I'm back to your message of I'm failing at this. As a psychologist specifically, can you talk a little bit about the psychology of dealing with that messaging and trying to come out with something positive for ourselves? Okay,
so let's just say that there is no such thing as an unmotivated person, which is kind of a radical concept. But this is when I'm asked to talk about how to improve adherence behaviors, my first slide is how there is no such thing as a non-adherent person, and compliance challenges are not about being unmotivated. Now I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So when people are making decisions about their, what they're eating, whether they're exercising, what medications they're on, how they're willing to take it, how often they're taking their insulin or bolusing, or any of the number of behaviors, they're making a decision based on their personal story, what's important to them, how they're prioritizing their life, their beliefs and expectations about diabetes. So are their perceptions of the benefits? Do they outweigh the obstacles that that person faces that particular day? And so if you can look at all the good reasons why you might struggle, why you may not take your medication, why you may struggle with your weight, if you were really able to look at all of the good reasons why you're having a challenge, then all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense. If you believe that every time you check your blood glucose and it's gonna, say a number that's high and it makes you feel like a failure, that every time you look at it, you're seeing a personal judgment instead of a number, why would you check? I mean, that makes sense. So a lot of times, if you look at the really good reasons why people struggle, the behavior makes sense. And so I think that's one of the first things that I talk about is when you're talking about, motivation and moving forward and changing the conversation, a lot of it has to be talking about what are the benefits to making the change? What are the benefits? When we're really good at saying to people, what the bad stuff is going to happen if you don't do what I'm telling you to do. What we don't tell people is why they should bother. You can live a long and healthy life with diabetes. We don't hear that often enough. So, there is no such thing as being unmotivated. The problem is diabetes and life together is a tough challenge.
Yeah, that's a tricky combo.
Mm-hmm.
Diabetes and life.
Yeah.
So here we have some more great comments in the chat room here. This is just a comment to share. This is a member who says, I was told by my endocrinologist, who is nationally renowned in the field of endocrinology, that I could fix my type 2 diabetes if I just lost 10 pounds. I came back having lost 10 pounds and not having any change in my actual diabetes. I felt terrible, and my endo said, well, maybe your diabetes just got worse. So this is one of those messaging pieces from healthcare providers that people struggle with. So here's a follow-up question to that. This is Brian who's saying, everybody has an idea about how I should manage my diabetes. How can I defend myself from these outside opinions? Can I come to terms and find personal happiness that I have done my best and I am a success?
I think that before you can have the courage to speak up, you have to decide that for yourself, that you give no power to what other people think about your diabetes. That if you're doing your best, we call that a healthy good enough. A healthy good enough reflects your personal best effort, given all that's going on in your life. And really the only one who can evaluate that is you. And so if you're doing a healthy good enough, then your numbers kind of are what they are. But if you can have a sense of I'm doing the best I can given my life circumstances, then I think that it's easier to push back and say, everybody who has diabetes has their own way of doing things, that it's a highly individualized disease management now. And what's right for, the guy over there is not necessarily right for me.
Absolutely. I agree. I feel like it's so important to just own, these are the decisions I'm making. These are the results that come from those decisions, and I'm okay with that. Or if I'm not okay with that, I'll work to change it, but I am still okay. I'm still an okay person. I'm not a failure. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a dumb person. I'm just a person making choices like absolutely everyone else in the whole wide world.
Yeah.
But of course, with diabetes, that's can be a lot easier said than done. So we have another member in the chat room, Linda, right now, who said that when she told a new doctor that she had type 2 diabetes, the response was, oh, type 2, that's nothing. So that, first off, is spectacularly dismissive. And Linda, I'm very sorry that you received that comment, and from somebody who clearly should know that type 2 diabetes is not nothing. But it also really speaks to this a social concept that we haven't actually even touched on yet, which is that a lot of people believe that there's such a thing as a good diabetes and a bad diabetes. I would say there's no good diabetes, although we can all find the bright side of all kinds of situations. But so what do you think of comments about the good diabetes and the bad diabetes?
Well, again, I think that that's a really big mistake. Again, because there is no good kind. And really, when somebody says that's no big deal, it minimizes the amount of work that goes into it. One of our colleagues sat in a standard diabetes education class, and she counted the number of behaviors that were recommended that people do different. So, things like, count your carbs, limit sweets and saturated fats, if you're on insulin, make sure you rotate your site, check your feet, if you smoke, quit, and the list went on. And she quit counting at 150 things. 150 things. So when somebody says to you, diabetes is no big deal, they have no idea about the job that goes into it, or the psychological burden of having to think every time you put something in your mouth, and having to think all the time about, the burden of planning ahead and making sure that, you have a safe meal to eat, or you have enough glucose tablets on you should you go low. And it really minimizes, I think, again, the burden of life with diabetes. Now, I have a chronic illness, not diabetes. I take 5 pills every night, and that's all I have to do. I don't think about it during the day. I don't have to manage it, and so it's, I think that what that shows is a lack of real understanding about real life diabetes.
Absolutely. Sometimes I wish that there was like a ticker tape that could go across our heads that would be displaying what we're thinking all the time, because I think for people with diabetes, regardless of type, that ticker tape, even as we're doing our jobs and having conversations and having relationships with loved ones and doing all the things that we do, the ticker tape would still be showing numbers and plans and when did I exercise and what did I eat and did I remember to take that medication and how much insulin should. That's sort of always going on in there for a lot of people with diabetes, and I think that's a piece of this sort of invisible condition problem that we have, is that folks have no idea that that's all going on in there because we do it in our heads, of course. And
I'd like to point out too, Emily, that even when people aren't doing the job, it's in their head. So even when people are, consciously choosing at some level maybe to not do their diabetes self-care, they're feeling bad about it. So it's not like even if you decide you're not going to do part of it, you have less of a mental burden, because my experience is even if you're not, doing the checks and you're eating more carbs than you've been recommended, all those times that you're not doing what you're supposed to do, that's a burden too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, one of the folks in the chat room earlier was saying that she feels guilt all the time about things that she eats. Mm-hmm. And frankly, one can feel with diabetes, one can feel guilty about really, really healthy choices if mm-hmm. they don't reflect in blood glucose levels that are what we want. You can eat something that's a really healthy food and end up with high blood sugar, and you feel like, boy, did I screw up. Mm-hmm. And so getting back into that, feeling personally like failures, it's a hard thing to escape.
Absolutely. And again, I think words like good and bad in diabetes should be completely eliminated, especially by healthcare professionals. Absolutely. Susan, this has been so interesting, and we have folks in the chat room who have been commenting and chatting among themselves, and also, as you've heard, sharing comments and questions, and a really, really rich topic of discussion that we will continue here on 2 Diabetes. Susan, thank you so much for being with us today. Sure, it was my pleasure.
Sharing your expertise. For folks who are watching, Susan is going to be back for another live interview in November on a related topic, again, as part of our Type 2 Diabetes live interview series that we're doing this month and next month. I hope that you will join us again for that. And Susan, take good care, be well, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Emily. Bye-bye.
Bye.